The snow fell soft and slow over Boston that December evening, dusting the wrought iron gates of Hawthorne Preparatory Academy until they looked like something out of a forgotten storybook. Inside the great glass atrium, crystal chandeliers turned the marble floor into a mirror, and a string quartet played something soft in Viennese that nobody really listened to. The evening had a name. It was called the Winter Scholarship Benefit. 2 months earlier, a fire had torn through the East Harbor housing block, and dozens of working families had lost everything they owned. The school had announced it would expand its scholarship program so that no child whose home had burned would lose their education, along with their bedroom. 400 guests had paid handsomely to attend, and the press release had used words like compassion and community and the future of our city. But the room itself told a different story. Men in tailored tuxedos murmured about tax shelters. Women in floor-length gowns adjusted their diamonds and complained, in voices not quite low enough, that the new scholarship students might lower the school's academic standards. One man laughed and told his table that if he donated enough, he expected the new wing of the library to bear his family name. The waiters carrying silver trays of champagne moved among them like ghosts, and not one guest looked them in the eye. Behind the stage, a man named Finn Granger checked the dimmer board for the 8th time. He was 29 years old, tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair cut close. He wore a navy suit that had been pressed 3 times. The event coordinator had called him only the maintenance guy and had not bothered to learn his name. He had grown up understanding that some kinds of work were taken for granted until they failed. His daughter Bonnie sat at the very last table near the side door, 6 years old, in a pale blue dress, her light brown hair tied back with a ribbon. In her lap she held a small cloth bag, and inside the bag were paper badges in the shape of suns, each one cut by hand and slightly uneven at the edges. Her babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and so she had come with her father, with strict instructions to be quiet. Finn knelt and straightened the collar of her cardigan and told her they would only stay another hour. Bonnie asked him whether all those grown-ups in the pretty clothes were really going to help the families whose houses had burned. Finn looked across the room at the polite smiles and the practiced laughter, and chose his answer carefully. "Some of them," he said. "Some of them really do mean it." At table 17, alone, sat a woman named Audrey Vance. She was 28, beautiful in the way that made people look twice and then look away, with chestnut hair that fell soft past her shoulders and a face that had learned how to keep itself perfectly still. She wore an ivory gown with a high neckline and no jewelry except a thin gold bracelet that had once belonged to her mother. A few of the older guests recognized her, vaguely, the way one recognizes a face from a story one no longer cares to remember. None of them came over to say hello. Finn was not from money. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the edge of Boston, the only son of a plumber and a night shift receptionist. From the time he was 6, he had watched his father take things apart on the kitchen table. Nothing in their house was ever replaced if it could be repaired, and his father, who spoke little, taught Finn early that a good repair was a kind of respect. He had not gone to a 4-year college. There had been no money for it. He had gone to a trade program, learned electrical work, and taken contracts at schools and hospitals and old churches whose wiring nobody else wanted to crawl into. He could read a building the way other men read a newspaper. He could hear a wire about to fail before it failed. He had married at 23. When Bonnie was born, he believed his life would be hard but full. But the rent had been high and the medical bills higher, and his wife had grown tired in a way that nothing he could say or fix would reach. One morning when Bonnie was 2, he had woken to find a folded letter on the kitchen counter. His wife was gone. She had left, she wrote, because she could not live a smaller life than the one she had imagined. He had not broken anything that morning. He had stood in the kitchen with the letter in his hand and listened to his daughter call out for him from her bedroom, and he had folded the letter twice and put it in the back of a drawer he never opened again. He had picked Bonnie up and made her breakfast. He had made a quiet promise that day, and he had kept it. His daughter would go without many things, but she would not go without a father who showed up. Once, when she was 5, Bonnie had asked him over breakfast whether she was the reason his life was so hard. Finn had set down his spoon and looked at her for a long moment. "You don't make my life harder," he had said. "You make me want to be a better man." He had said it once, and somewhere in him he understood that one day he would have to prove that sentence in front of strangers. Audrey Vance had not always sat alone at parties. Once, 6 years earlier, she had been the only daughter of a man who had built a small fortune investing in private schools and community medical centers. Her father had been an honest man, perhaps too honest. He had trusted a partner who turned out to forge his name on a bond agreement, and within a single fiscal quarter, the firm had collapsed. The Vance family had lost almost everything. The world Audrey had grown up in did not forgive collapse. The men who had eaten Sunday dinners at her father's table stopped returning his calls. At 22, she had been called to testify in a financial inquiry, and a tabloid reporter had filmed her stumbling over a question about her family's accounts. The clip had spread through the financial circles of the East Coast within a day, and a nickname had attached itself to her like a brand: the broken heiress. She had gone, in the months that followed, to ask for work at the very institutions her family had once funded. She had sat in one such office and listened to a venture investor say, quite casually, that he never bought a seat next to a bankruptcy. That sentence had lived in her for years. She did not become bitter. She became precise. She studied financial restructuring and the law of nonprofits and the architecture of failing institutions. She found that most of these places had not collapsed for lack of money. They had collapsed because the people in charge had forgotten to look at the people who needed them. After 6 quiet years, she founded the Vance Renewal Group. The firm bought struggling institutions, restructured the leadership, removed the boards that had captured them, and rebuilt the inner machinery so that scholarships went to children and safety inspections went to inspectors. She rarely appeared in public. She let the results speak for her. Hawthorne Preparatory Academy had come to her firm 3 months before, and what her team had found was not promising. The school's scholarship endowment had been quietly redirected toward image campaigns. The dormitory wiring had not been inspected to current code in 11 years. The Parents Association had grown into a small, hard kingdom run by a man named Clinton Vale, who wrote larger checks than anyone else, and who had begun to behave as though that gave him the right to choose which children deserved to belong. Audrey had decided to attend the benefit anonymously, before signing anything. She wanted to see the place when it thought no one important was watching. So she had taken a single seat at table 17, and she had waited. Clinton Vale, 42, was the kind of man who learned a room by counting the eyes already on him. He took the microphone at 9:05. He wore a charcoal tuxedo and a watch that cost more than the annual salary of every teacher in the room. He had a smooth voice and a smile he had practiced in the mirror, and he believed that wealth conferred the right to judge people. He had been told that an emissary of the Vance Renewal Group would attend the gala. He had not been told who. When he saw Audrey at table 17, he felt a small, mean spark of pleasure. He thought of her as a story, the kind a man told at a bar to feel sharper than the woman in the story. He turned to 2 of his closest associates at the head table and proposed, in a low voice, a small addition to the auction. A novelty. The seat next to the failed heiress. $10. Just enough to get a laugh. One of the men hesitated. Clinton waved him off. "She's used to being looked at," he said, and the words fell into the air with the quiet cruelty of a man who had never been looked at the way she had. It was at that moment that Clinton's eyes found Finn Granger near the side of the stage. A few months earlier, Finn had filed a written safety complaint about a fire door in the East Wing being chained shut during a private event. Clinton had been the one who ordered the chain. The complaint had embarrassed him at a board meeting, and he had not forgiven it. So now Clinton arranged in his head a small theater piece. A woman the room would laugh at. A maintenance contractor the room could pity. A $10 seat to bind them together for the entertainment of 400 well-fed guests. He did not think of it as cruelty. He thought of it as charm. He stepped to the microphone and tapped it once. He thanked the donors. He spoke a few polished sentences about community, and the children of East Harbor, and the legacy of Hawthorne. The room applauded politely, the way rooms do when they have been trained. Then he leaned forward and smiled. "Tonight," he said, "in addition to the silver auction, we have something a little more spirited. A seat. Yes, just a seat. But ladies and gentlemen, some seats are valuable for what they are next to, and some seats require a little courage." A few uncertain laughs scattered through the room. Audrey lifted her eyes. She understood, in the space of a single breath, what was about to happen. Clinton gestured with his glass. "The seat beside Miss Vance," he said, and let the name sit just long enough to be recognized by the older guests. The seat beside Miss Vance, who, if I recall correctly, once commanded quite a price in financial circles. Tonight, in the spirit of charity, we will start the bidding low. $10. The laughter came in a wave, not all at once but in a rolling, ugly tide. Some laughed because they remembered the old story. Others laughed because they did not, and they were afraid of being left out of whatever joke this was. Audrey did not move. Her face stayed calm. Only her hand, beneath the tablecloth, tightened around the cloth napkin in her lap until her knuckles whitened. Bonnie, at the table by the side door, looked up and understood without understanding. She did not know what Wall Street was, and she did not know what bankruptcy meant. She knew the shape of people laughing at someone. She knew it the way a child knows weather. She pulled her bag of paper Suns closer to her chest. Clinton scanned the back of the room as if searching, but his eyes found exactly the man he intended to find. "Mr. Granger," he said brightly, "are you still with us? A practical man like yourself, surely you can appreciate a bargain. $10 to sit beside a woman who once cost Wall Street rather more. What do you say?" 400 faces turned. Finn stood very still. He looked at Clinton. He looked at Audrey. He saw a woman holding a stillness that did not belong to comfort. Then he looked at Bonnie. She was watching him, not curiously, not the way a child watches a stranger, but the way a child watches her father to learn what kind of world she lives in. Finn understood that whatever he did next would teach her a sentence she would carry the rest of her life. If he laughed, she would learn that grown-ups were allowed to laugh at lonely women. If he walked away, she would learn that good men were quiet when rooms got cruel. There was no third path that did not cost something. He stepped forward, slowly, into the warm circle of light at the front of the hall. He took his wallet from his inside pocket and drew out a single $10 bill, soft at the corners from being folded too long. The room saw the bill and laughed harder, mistaking compliance for surrender. Finn placed the bill flat on the auction table. He did not look at the money. He looked at Clinton. His voice, when it came, was not loud. "I am not buying the chair," he said. "I am giving back the respect that all of you just lost." The room did not laugh again. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of 400 people who had just been told something true about themselves, and had not yet decided whether to admit it. Finn did not press the moment. He stepped down from the small platform, walked across the polished marble floor, past the tables where forks lay frozen above plates, and stopped 2 paces from where Audrey sat. He inclined his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said, quietly enough that only she and the nearest table could hear, "I am sorry they brought you into this." She looked up at him. She had been waiting for the look she had seen on 100 well-meaning men's faces over the years. The pity, the self-congratulation, the faint expectation of gratitude. He did not have any of it. He was simply standing there, calm, a little tired, sorry in a way that did not seem to be about him. He laid his hand on the back of the empty chair beside her, but he did not pull it out yet. "Would you like me to sit?" he said. "Or would you rather we go outside? You decide. No one in this room is choosing for you anymore." She did not answer right away. The sentence had landed somewhere beneath the rib she had spent 6 years protecting. All her life she had been told where to sit, what to wear, when to smile, when to disappear, by men who believed her presence was theirs to arrange. He was the first man in a long time who had asked. "You can sit," she said. He nodded and pulled the chair out. Then he turned his head and lifted one hand toward the back of the room. Bonnie stood up at her own table. She walked carefully along the side aisle, holding her cloth bag tightly against her chest. When she reached her father, he pulled out a second chair, and she climbed into it, and he placed his hand gently on her shoulder. He did not say a word. The hand said everything. A few yards away, Clinton attempted a laugh and almost made it. "He is making this into a scene," he said to the room. "We were having fun." Nobody answered him. An older teacher at a center table had lowered her face into her hand. A waiter, paused along the wall with an empty tray, was watching Finn with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but had pieces of both. Bonnie was watching Audrey. She saw the white knuckles on the napkin. She saw the careful stillness of a face that was trying not to break. She did not know the word dignity yet, but she knew its opposite. She opened her cloth bag with both hands and lifted out one of her paper suns. The cut was a little crooked. The yellow was a little uneven. She placed it on the white tablecloth in front of Audrey and slid it forward with 2 careful fingers. "I make these for people who are having a sad day," she whispered. "You can keep it if you want." Audrey looked at the small, uneven sun. In a room of monogrammed checkbooks and engraved silver, it was the first object she had been given that night that did not want anything from her. She picked the sun up gently and set it next to her water glass. "Thank you," she said. Her voice did not quite hold. Finn did not ask her what she did. He simply asked, in the same plain voice, whether she wanted ice. She nodded. He flagged a waiter. The waiter, who had been waiting all evening to be useful in a way that mattered, almost ran. It was the smallest courtesy in the world, and in that room, on that night, it was a kind of revolution. Clinton could not bear the silence. He stepped down from the platform with his glass still in his hand and walked, slowly, over to table 17, smiling the way a man smiles when he does not yet know that his smile has stopped being a weapon. "Finn," he said, with a chuckle that did not reach his eyes. "I had no idea you were so sensitive. We are just raising money. Honestly, the picture is not bad." A single father who fixes light fixtures sitting next to a bankrupt heiress. Very on theme for a charity gala. The room cooled by another degree. A few of the guests at the nearest tables looked away. None of them spoke. This was the second silence of the night, and it was worse than the first, because it was the silence of people who knew exactly what was happening and were still afraid of being the first to object. Finn set his water glass down so it made no sound. He looked at Bonnie first. She had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the paper sun. He understood in the tightening of her small jaw that she was frightened, and that if he answered Clinton with anger, his daughter would learn that her father was a man who fought with anger when he was hurt. He was not going to teach her that. He stood. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Clinton without contempt, which was, in some ways, worse than contempt. "I fix light fixtures," he said. "I fix circuit panels. I fix fire doors. I do work that most people only remember when it stops working. I am not ashamed of any of it." He paused, and the room leaned in without meaning to. "But tonight," he said, "I have seen something more broken than the wiring in this building. I have seen a room full of grown adults who believed that if they dressed expensively enough, their cruelty would be called charm." The sentence did not land on Clinton alone. It landed on every guest who had laughed at the $10 joke and on every guest who had not laughed, but had not stood up either. Several heads dropped. A woman in the front row pressed her napkin to her mouth. Clinton tried to recover. "You are trying to make yourself a hero," he said. "Be honest, Finn. Would you really sit next to that woman if there were not 400 people watching?" Finn turned, just slightly, toward Audrey. He saw she was steady. "Yes," he said. The single word fell like a stone into still water. "I would sit next to anyone who had been turned into a joke because the people in the room decided she had run out of reasons to be respected." Clinton's mouth thinned. "You do not even know who she is." Finn said it then, and the line that came out of his mouth was the line that the rest of his life would be measured against. "I do not need to know who she is," he said. To know that she does not deserve to be treated like this. Audrey, beside him, closed her eyes for one slow second. When she opened them again, she was no longer the woman who had walked into the room. She was a woman who had been seen. Clinton looked around for someone to back him up. The two friends he had whispered with earlier had drifted. A man at the head table was suddenly very interested in his dessert plate. The room was no longer his. He turned back, the smile thinning into something tighter. "You are going to regret this," he said softly. "Believe me." Finn did not answer him. He sat back down, took his daughter's small hand under the table, and waited. It was Bonnie who broke the next silence. She slid out of her chair. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood between her father and Clinton, her bag of paper suns hugged to her chest, her hair a little crooked at the ribbon, and looked up at the man who had been laughing. "My daddy says," she said, "that if somebody makes another person cry and then says it was a joke, it is not a joke. They just do not want to say sorry." The whole room heard her. 6 years old. 2 sentences. 400 adults stilled. Clinton opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There was no answer in his head that did not make him sound like a man arguing with a child, and a man arguing with a child in front of an audience is never the man the audience leaves admiring. Bonnie turned, very gently, to Audrey. She saw the wet shine at the edges of Audrey's eyes. She lifted the paper sun a little, where it lay beside the water glass, and pushed it just an inch closer. "You do not have to smile if you are sad," she said. "My daddy says people who are sad do not owe anybody a smile." Audrey broke. Not loudly. A single tear slipped down, and she did not lift her hand to hide it. For 6 years she had been smiling in rooms that wanted her gone. A 6-year-old with crooked yellow paper had just given her permission to put the performance down. She picked up the sun and held it cupped in her palm as if it were warm. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. Finn knelt next to his daughter. He laid one hand on the top of her head and said, very quietly, "You have said enough now, sweetheart." Bonnie nodded. She climbed back into her chair. Across the room, the older teacher who had hidden her face was now openly wiping her eyes. The string quartet, in the alcove, had not played a single note in 3 full minutes, and no one seemed to notice. Audrey turned her head slowly toward Clinton. There was no anger in her face. There was, instead, something far worse for a man like him: clarity. "It has been a long time," she said, in a voice steadier than her tears, "since I was defended by people who did not need to know what I had to give them." Behind Clinton, the great glass doors of the atrium swung open. The headmaster, George Whitman, 60 years old, white-haired, walked in with the brisk anxiety of a man who had been searching for someone for 20 minutes. 2 members of the Hawthorne ward followed him, along with a young assistant carrying a leather folder. They had been preparing the formal signing room upstairs. George's eyes swept the room and stopped on table 17. He saw Audrey, holding a paper sun, her eyes wet, her ivory gown unmistakable. He saw the maintenance contractor sitting beside her with his daughter. He saw Clinton Vale standing alone in the middle of the floor, slightly off balance. His face changed. He crossed the room quickly, the soles of his shoes making the only sound in the silence. He stopped a respectful distance from her chair and bowed his head. "Miss Vance," he said, "I am so sorry. I was unaware that you had been delayed down here. The board is ready to receive you whenever you wish." The room heard the name. It heard the tone, too. Not the tone a man uses with a forgotten heiress, but the tone he uses with a person who holds his future in her hand. The ripple of recognition began at the front, and traveled backward through the tables in slow, quiet waves. "Miss Vance," someone whispered. A man at the second table stiffened in his seat. Another set down his glass too hard. Clinton Vale, in the middle of the floor, went still in a way that was not stillness at all but the early shape of fear. George turned to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "allow me to introduce properly Miss Audrey Vance, the Chief Executive Officer of the Vance Renewal Group, the institution that has been considering a $40 million restoration and scholarship endowment for Hawthorne Preparatory Academy." The room did not gasp. It was past gasping. It went, instead, into the deep, sick stillness of people who realize, all at once, that they have shown their true face to the wrong stranger. Clinton tried to laugh. The laugh came out thin. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "It was a fundraising bit. Miss Vance, I'm sure you understand." Audrey rose. She did not shout. She set the paper Sun gently into her clutch, smoothed the front of her ivory gown, and looked at Clinton without hatred and without theater. "You are correct about one thing," she said. "Tonight was a test. But not the test you imagined. Not a test of who would pay the most for a chair. A test of who in this room could still recognize the dignity of a person they believed had nothing to give them." Clinton tried again. "Miss Vance, I did not know." "That," she said, very gently, "is precisely the point. You did not know who I was, so you allowed yourself to be cruel." She turned to George. "The signing," she said, "will not take place tonight. I am not canceling this firm's involvement with Hawthorne. I am pausing it. Pending a complete review of the scholarship endowment, the parents' council structure, the maintenance contracts, the safety code compliance of every dormitory and every fire door in this building, and the conduct culture at every public event this school has held in the past 3 years." George bowed his head. Audrey turned back to the room. "Some of you," she said, "were laughing tonight. Some of you were not. I am going to remember which." She did not say it as a threat. She said it as a fact. Then she sat back down beside a maintenance contractor and his 6-year-old daughter and asked the waiter, in a soft and even voice, if he might bring her a glass of water. The next morning, no scandal video appeared on any news outlet. Audrey had instructed her people before leaving that she did not wish the night to be turned into entertainment. She had spent 6 years being entertainment. She would not pay another woman or man back in the same currency. But inside Hawthorne, the change moved fast. Within the week, Clinton Vale was asked to step down from the Parents' Council. His consultancy quietly lost its access to the school's vendor list. An independent audit was opened, and within a month, it was clear that significant scholarship funds had been redirected, over several years, into image and branding work that benefited a small circle of wealthy donor families. Just enough to confirm that the place had drifted. Audrey's conditions when she sent them through her firm were clear. A scholarship fund with independent oversight, including a teacher, a non-administrative staff member, a working parent, and 1 student member. A complete safety review of every fire door, every electrical panel, every alarm system, every dormitory. A permanent prohibition on fundraising practices that involve the public humiliation of any individual. A new program supporting the children of Hawthorne's own staff, so that the people who scrubbed its floors and rewired its lights could send their own children through its halls. It was the last condition that caused the most quiet weeping among the kitchen staff, who had been told for years that this was a school for other people's children. 3 weeks after the gala, Audrey asked Finn to come to her office. He arrived in a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a knit cap he had pulled off only after the elevator. He had assumed she meant to thank him. Instead, she set a folder on the table between them. The cover read, "The Sun Seat Initiative." She told him what was inside. A program to fund scholarship seats, transitional housing and safety inspections in schools serving working families. A pilot at Hawthorne, with plans to expand to 4 other cities within 2 years. The name had come from his daughter. She wanted him to be the field safety supervisor. He started, immediately, to refuse. He said he did not have the credentials. She slid a second folder toward him. It contained, in chronological order, every safety report he had filed at Hawthorne in the past 2 years. The chained fire door, the overloaded stage circuit die, the classroom outlet that ran abnormally hot. Every report had been ignored. "I have read your reports," she said. "You see danger before people with titles do. I do not need another person who speaks well in conference rooms. I need someone who knows that a stuck door can keep a child from getting out." He sat for a long moment. He thought about Bonnie, asleep in their small apartment with her bag of paper suns on the nightstand. He thought about the children of East Harbor, who had no doors at all anymore. He took the job that night. 6 months later, in late spring, Hawthorne held a small ceremony in its renovated library. There was no auction. There were folding chairs and a long table of cookies the cafeteria staff had baked themselves, and a clean wooden plaque newly mounted by the door. Finn arrived in a pale blue dress shirt and a simple jacket. Bonnie walked beside him in a soft yellow dress, a fresh bag of paper suns over her shoulder. She had decided on the way over that she would give one to each of the new scholarship students. Audrey arrived in a cream gown, her hair down, her face softer than it had been in December. She still carried the same authority, but she no longer wore it like armor. Near the library door stood a small glass display case. Inside, on white cloth, lay two objects. A folded $10 bill, slightly worn at the corners. A single paper sun, a little uneven at the edges. Beneath them, in plain black lettering, were 3 words. Dignity is never cheap. Audrey stood before the small crowd and spoke briefly. She said that the scholarship fund had not been built out of pity. She said it had been built out of a single principle, that no child in any school should ever be taught that their parents were worth less because their parents worked with their hands. She named, by their first names, the 7 new scholarship students seated in the front row. She did not pose for photographs. A woman near the back, who had lost her apartment in the East Harbor fire, was told that morning that her son had been admitted on full scholarship for the coming year. She wept quietly into her hand, and the woman next to her, a teacher, simply held her wrist. Finn did not step forward to claim any credit. He had spent the morning checking the new emergency lighting in the back hallway. He noticed even now that one hinge on the library door was making the smallest of squeaks. He made a quiet note to bring oil tomorrow. He was still a man who fixed the things that needed fixing. After the ceremony, Bonnie tugged on Audrey's hand and asked, in a voice almost too soft to hear, "Are you still sad about that night?" Audrey knelt. She opened her small clutch and showed the child what was inside. The original paper sun, slightly flattened now, kept carefully in a clear sleeve. "I still remember," she said. "But I am not ashamed anymore. Because that night, I learned that there was someone in the room who would sit beside me before he knew who I was." The 3 of them walked together to the new study room at the back of the library. Finn's eyes softened as he watched his daughter run ahead and press a paper sun into the hand of a small boy seated next to his mother. Audrey walked slowly beside Finn. "You know," she said, "if you had walked away that night, I would have understood." He looked ahead, where his daughter was laughing for the first time in a room full of strangers. "I have let a lot of things people said about me go," he said, "but my daughter was watching. There are some moments when a father is not allowed to be quiet." Audrey was silent for a few steps. Then she said, almost to herself, perhaps that is why the room changed. Outside, late afternoon, light came through the tall library windows and fell, in a long pale rectangle, across the small glass case by the door. It lit the $10 bill and the slightly crooked paper sun, and for a moment they did not look like objects at all. They looked like a quiet sentence, written in a language the rest of the room had finally learned to read. Finn Granger had not walked into Hawthorne Preparatory Academy that December evening to become anyone's hero. He had walked in to fix a dimmer board and to take his daughter home for soup. But sometimes, the most broken thing in a room is not in the wiring, and not in the walls, and not in the fixtures overhead. Sometimes the most broken thing is the way the people inside have stopped looking at one another like people. And on that snowed-in night in Boston with a $10 bill, a chair the room tried to sell for a laugh, and a small girl carrying a bag of paper suns, a quiet man reminded 400 strangers, and one watching daughter, what dignity actually costs.